Hey guys, tonight we are going to crawl inside a medieval castle, pull back the heavy wool blankets, and find out what it was actually like to fall asleep in one of history's most dramatic, drafty, and surprisingly crowded buildings. You are going to feel the cold stone beneath your feet, smell the wood smoke hanging in the air, and hear the sounds that filled the darkness long before anyone invented blackout curtains or a white noise app. And fair warning, you probably won't survive this particular bedtime in anything close to the comfort you are used to, because the medieval castle at night was less a place of peaceful rest and more a living, breathing organism that never truly went quiet. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. I genuinely love seeing those roll in from every corner of the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It begins, as so many medieval stories do, with a road. A bad one. You have been riding for the better part of the day, maybe longer, and the light has been failing for the last hour in that slow, unstoppable way that autumn light fails in northern Europe. Not all at once, but in gradual surrenders, the gold bleeding out of the sky until only a deep, bruised blue remains, and then even that gives up. The trees along the track have become silhouettes. The mud beneath your horse's hooves has turned invisible. And somewhere ahead, rising out of the gloom like something that was grown rather than built, the castle appears. You see the torches first. They flicker along the battlements, tiny orange wounds in the darkness, and for a moment the whole fortress looks like nothing so much as a great sleeping animal, its outline jagged against the sky, its breath the thin smoke rising from somewhere within. The sight is, honestly, both reassuring and slightly terrifying, which is precisely the effect it was designed to have. This is the thing about medieval castles that gets lost when you visit them as ruins on a pleasant Sunday afternoon. They were not romantic. They were not picturesque. They were tools. Big, heavy, expensive tools built with one overriding purpose: to control the landscape, the people in it, and the movement of everyone who wanted to get from one place to another. The romance came later, added by poets and painters who had the luxury of admiring these structures from a safe historical distance. When you are actually arriving at one on a cold October evening in, say, 1247, what you feel is not romance. What you feel is relief that you made it before the gates closed, and a low-grade anxiety about what happens inside. Because the gates do close. This is the first thing you need to understand about sleeping in a medieval castle. The night brings a lockdown that is total, deliberate, and non-negotiable. As the last light fades, the great wooden gates, bound with iron and hung on hinges that could absorb a battering ram, are swung shut and barred from within. The portcullis, that heavy iron or iron-tipped wooden grill that you have definitely seen in movies, drops into place with a sound you feel in your chest as much as here. Drawbridges, where they exist, are raised. Smaller postern gates in the side walls are locked and bolted. The castle has, in the language of the era, been secured for the night. What this means in practice is that the boundary between outside and inside has become absolute. The world beyond those walls, the forest, the road, the village, the darkness full of whatever your imagination wants to put in it, is now categorically separate from the world within. And the world within is about to undergo a transformation that most visitors, had they been there, would have found deeply strange. You pass through the gate just in time. The guards give you the particular look that gatekeepers throughout history have reserved for people who cut it close, and you ride into the bailey, the open courtyard that forms the heart of most castle designs. During the day, this space would be almost chaotically busy. Livestock penned in one corner, a blacksmith's forge throwing sparks nearby, laundresses hauling water, grooms leading horses, merchants negotiating with the steward, children getting underfoot, dogs getting everywhere. Medieval castles were not just military installations. They were administrative centers, agricultural hubs, and surprisingly dense communities. Historians still argue whether a large castle in full operation was more like a modern small town or more like a corporate headquarters with a resident army. But either way, the bailey by day was loud, smelly, and packed. By the time you arrive, though, it has already begun to empty. The livestock have been driven into their shelters, a matter of both their safety and the safety of the food supply they represent. since a dead cow in winter is a genuine catastrophe. The forge is dark and cooling. The laundry is done. The merchants, if there were any, have either secured lodging within or left before the gates closed. What remains in the bailey now is the low amber light of torches, the smell of manure and hay and wood smoke, and a handful of servants moving with the particular purposeful quiet of people who have one last set of tasks to complete before they can themselves find somewhere horizontal. You hand your horse to a groom. There is always a groom at this hour. This is not a courtesy. This is because horses are extraordinarily valuable and their welfare is someone's specific, non-optional responsibility, and you are directed toward the Great Hall. The Great Hall is the beating heart of the castle, the room that everything else is organized around, and entering it for the first time at night is an experience that hits every sense simultaneously. The fire, or fires, larger castles often had multiple hearths, are still burning, throwing uneven light across a space that is almost certainly bigger than any room you have been in today. The ceiling, if you can see it through the smoke, is high and dark. The walls are hung with tapestries in the wealthier establishments, bare stone or lime-washed plaster in the more modest ones. Long trestle tables that were set up for the evening meal are in various stages of being disassembled and moved to the sides of the room, because one of the Great Hall's primary nighttime functions is as a dormitory. This is the quirky, slightly uncomfortable truth about medieval castle life that the movies almost always skip over in their rush to get to the banquet scene. The Great Hall was not just where you ate. It was where most of the castle's population slept. The trestle tables, brilliant invention incidentally, specifically because they could be broken down and stored, were cleared away. The rushes on the floor were either refreshed or resigned to another night of service, and somewhere between 30 and 100 people, depending on the size of the household, would make their beds on the floor of this room. We will get to the specifics of those beds shortly, and we will get to the question of who slept where and why, because that is one of the most revealing things about medieval social structure you can possibly examine. But for now, as you stand in the Great Hall with the fire warming one side of your face and the cold stone floor chilling the air around your feet, what you need to appreciate is the sheer density of human occupation in this space. The Great Hall at night smelled of smoke and bodies and the remnants of the evening meal and the rushes underfoot and the dogs that had not quite been removed yet. It was not quiet. There was always someone coughing, someone snoring, someone muttering in their sleep, the fire settling, the castle making the small structural adjustments that large stone buildings make when the temperature drops. It was not dark, exactly. Fires and the occasional rush light or tallow candle maintained a dim, wavering illumination throughout the night, partly for safety and partly because total darkness in a room full of sleeping people and open flames was a recipe for the kind of disaster you do not recover from. And it was certainly not private. Privacy as a concept is one of the great luxuries of the modern world, and if you have any attachment to it, the medieval castle at night is going to be a significant challenge for you. The hall was communal in a way that goes beyond anything most 21st century people experience regularly. You slept near strangers, near colleagues, near people you might actively dislike, near people of varying social ranks, all within earshot and often within arm's reach of each other. But before you reach that floor, there are rituals to observe. The castle is not simply a building that people happen to sleep in. It is a highly organized social machine, and the transition from day to night is managed according to protocols that are, in their own way, as elaborate as anything that happens during the waking hours. The lord of the castle, if present, would have retired earlier in the evening. We will follow him to his chamber in a later section, because that journey tells its own story. For now, your concern is the series of small ceremonies that mark the castle's passage into night. The curfew bell is one of them. The word curfew, which you use today to mean any restriction on nighttime movement, comes directly from the old French couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire. This tells you everything about medieval priorities. The single most important task at the end of the day was making sure that the fires in the castle were banked and covered, because an unattended fire in a building that is mostly wood and stone, filled with straw and textiles and people in woolen clothes, is an existential threat. The curfew bell was the signal to cover all fires that needed covering, extinguish any lights that were unnecessary, and begin the formal settling of the castle for the night. The bell itself was usually rung from the chapel, which adds a pleasing liturgical weight to what is essentially a fire safety announcement. After the bell, the watch changes. The guards who have been on duty through the evening are replaced by the night watch, a rotation of men whose specific job is to patrol the walls and the interior throughout the darkness, watching for fire, for intruders, for anything that should not be there. We will spend more time with them later tonight, because the sounds they make as they move through the castle are going to be part of your nighttime soundtrack, whether you want them to be or not. For now, you find your place in the Great Hall. Someone points you to a section of floor, or perhaps a bench along the wall, and you begin the particular medieval process of making yourself a sleeping space out of whatever is available. The fire is lower now, settling into a deep orange glow that does more for warmth than light. The hall, which was already quieter than it was an hour ago, grows quieter still. The dogs have been removed, or have removed themselves to corners. The last of the servants have finished their tasks and found their own spots. And the castle, this enormous, complicated, cold, and oddly alive structure, begins in its own way to rest. Not fully, never fully. The guards walk their circuits. The fire breathes. The horses in the stable shift their weight. A dog somewhere in the bailey barks once at something in the dark and then thinks better of it. The castle at night is not silent. It is never silent. It has its own rhythms, its own sounds, its own pulse, and you are going to become very familiar with all of them before the sun rises again. But for now, in this first settling hour, with the smell of smoke and the warmth of the dying fire and the murmur of 100 people making their separate arrangements with sleep, there is something almost peaceful about it. Almost. The stone is cold under the rushes. There is definitely something moving in the straw near your left knee. Someone 3 feet away from you is already snoring with an enthusiasm that suggests they have been doing this for years and have never once felt bad about it. Welcome to the medieval castle at night. You are going to need every bit of that exhaustion to sleep through this. The floor of the Great Hall is, as you are already discovering, not an ideal sleeping surface. But before you spend too much time feeling sorry for yourself down there among the rushes and the questionable biological history of the straw, it is worth lifting your eyes and understanding the full geography of where you have landed, because the castle at night is not one experience. It is many experiences, stacked vertically and arranged horizontally according to a social logic so precise, so deliberate, and so thoroughly internalized by everyone who lives here that no one needs to explain it. You simply know, or rather, everyone who belongs here simply knows. You, arriving after dark on a tired horse, are about to learn it the way newcomers always learn social hierarchies, by watching where everyone else goes and noticing who gets the good spots. The medieval castle's sleeping arrangements are, in the most literal possible sense, a map of power. Where you sleep tells everyone who you are. How you sleep, on what surface, under what covering, in what degree of enclosure or exposure, announces your rank as clearly as your clothing or your accent or the horse you rode in on. And the distance between the best sleeping situation in the castle and the worst is not merely a matter of comfort. It is a matter of survival, dignity, and the entire social cosmology of the medieval world compressed into a single night. Let us start at the top. Not metaphorically, literally at the top, because in most castle designs, the higher you go, the more important you are. The lord and lady of the castle sleep in the solar or great chamber, a room that sits above the Great Hall, accessible via a staircase that is, in older castles, a tight spiral of stone, and, in later, grander designs, something more deliberately impressive. The solar, from the Latin solarium, suggesting a room that catches the sun, though many of them caught precious little of it, is the innermost sanctum of the castle's domestic life. It is where the family actually lives, as distinct from the Great Hall where the household performs its collective existence. The solar is private in a way that almost nothing else in the castle is. It has a door that can be locked. It has, in the better appointed examples, a fireplace of its own, which in a world where warmth is a genuine luxury rather than a thermostat adjustment represents an almost extravagant comfort. It has a bed, and we will spend considerable time with that bed in the next section, because it deserves its own examination, and it has, typically, a level of decoration and furnishing that reflects the lord's wealth and status. Tapestries on the walls, chests for storage, perhaps a prie-dieu, a small prayer desk in one corner, because the medieval bedroom was also a place of private worship in a way that the modern bedroom usually is not. The lord does not sleep alone, or at least not in the way you might imagine alone to mean. His wife sleeps beside him, which is worth stating plainly because the marital bed was a legal and social institution as much as a personal arrangement. The marriage bed, the specific bed in which a marriage was consummated, had documentary and legal significance. It could be cited in disputes over inheritance. It could be called as evidence in questions of legitimacy. The bed was not just furniture, it was testimony. Historians still argue whether the elaborate ceremony of putting to bed that attended aristocratic marriages, in which guests literally accompanied the couple to their chamber and witnessed the initial rituals of the wedding night, was primarily about celebration, social bonding, or legal verification, and the honest answer is probably all three simultaneously, which is a very medieval way of doing things. The Lord also does not sleep without attendants nearby. This is the aspect of medieval noble sleeping arrangements that tends to surprise modern listeners most consistently. Even at the highest level of the hierarchy, even in the most private room in the castle, you are not alone. The Lord would typically have a body servant or personal attendant who slept in or immediately adjacent to the chamber. In the grander households, this position, sleeping in the Lord's room, ready to respond to any need through the night, was not a menial one. It was a position of significant trust and, in some cases, considerable political intimacy. The people who attended great lords through their nights heard things, saw things, and were privy to moments of vulnerability that no one else witnessed. This made them powerful in ways that their nominal rank did not necessarily reflect. Directly below the solar in the social hierarchy, though not always directly below it architecturally, come the senior members of the household, the steward, who manages the castle's domestic operations, the marshal, who oversees the horses and military organization, senior knights who are part of the permanent household rather than passing guests, and, in larger establishments, a whole tier of officials whose titles tell you exactly how elaborately medieval aristocratic households were organized. The chamberlain managed the lord's private chambers. The pantler managed the bread. The butler, and yes, this is where that word comes from, managed the bottles, meaning the wine and ale supply, which was both a practical and a diplomatic responsibility of considerable weight. These senior figures do not sleep in the great hall with everyone else. They have their own chambers or they share chambers in small groups, and these rooms represent a middle tier of sleeping experience that is meaningfully better than the hall floor without being anywhere near the comfort of the solar. A room of one's own, or nearly so, with a proper bed or at least a decent pallet, a door, and some degree of insulation from the collective noise of the household. These are real privileges in a world where such things are not given but earned through service, loyalty, and the slow accumulation of the Lord's trust. The knights who are guests rather than permanent household members occupy a similar tier, depending on their rank and the Lord's estimation of them. A visiting baron might be given a chamber of his own, perhaps one that has been hastily prepared with fresh linens and whatever furnishings could be assembled on short notice. A minor knight passing through on business might find himself with a bench in a passageway or a spot in the great hall that is nevertheless positioned closer to the high end, the end nearest the dais where the Lord's table sits, than to the low end, because even within the communal sleeping space of the great hall, proximity to the dais matters. The esquires, young men of good family who are attached to the household as part of their training, learning the arts of war and courtly behavior simultaneously, typically sleep in the hall or in a chamber attached to it, grouped together, which in practice means they spend at least some of the night not sleeping at all but engaging in the whispering, jostling, and low-grade mischief that young men in communal sleeping arrangements have engaged in throughout all of recorded history. This is one of those historical constants that requires no documentation because it has never, not once, been otherwise. The pages, younger still, boys of 8 to 14, also of good family, also in training, sleep nearby, under the supervision of older household members whose job it is to make sure they are actually resting and not doing whatever it is that pages do when no one is watching. Which, based on the surviving records of medieval household management, appears to have been quite a lot. Now we descend further down the hall, metaphorically and spatially, to the servants. The division here is between the upper servants, who have been sleeping on benches or decent pallets in the better parts of the hall, and the lower servants, who have been sleeping on the floor rushes, on straw, on whatever horizontal surface they can claim. And then below even them, though this is a distinction that the modern eye might miss, are the outdoor servants, the stable hands and the kennel workers and the people whose jobs keep them tethered to the parts of the castle that are not even inside the main buildings. The stable hands sleep with the horses. This sounds like a hardship, and in terms of social status it absolutely is one, but in terms of thermal comfort it is actually not the worst arrangement. Horses generate substantial body heat, and a stable full of large mammals on a cold night is considerably warmer than a great hall with a fire that is dying down for safety reasons. The grooms and stable boys who bed down in the hay alongside the animals they care for are not comfortable in any way you would recognize as comfort, but they are warm, which in a northern European winter is a non-trivial advantage. A quirky footnote that medieval people themselves would probably not have found funny, but we might appreciate at a safe historical distance. The horses were almost certainly better fed than the stable hands, because a sick horse was a financial catastrophe and a sick groom was a personnel problem, and medieval economics were very clear on which of those was more serious. The kennel workers sleep with the dogs. The dogs sleep with each other. Everyone in the kennel sleeps in a warm, aromatic pile, and we will leave that image right there. Below the regular servants in the social calculus of the sleeping hall are any prisoners the castle might be holding, and most operational castles held at least occasional prisoners, because the castle was also a judicial and administrative center, and the administration of justice produced, almost inevitably, people who needed to be confined somewhere. These individuals sleep in conditions that ranged from the merely uncomfortable to the genuinely dangerous, depending on their rank, their crime, and their lord's disposition. A noble prisoner held for ransom might be housed in a decent room, perhaps even with some comforts, because his value was directly tied to his survival and his family's willingness to pay. A common criminal might be in a cellar or a pit, conditions that we will not dwell on tonight because this is a bedtime story and we are trying to ease you towards sleep, not away from it. And then, threading through all of these layers and categories, there is one more group of sleepers that does not fit neatly into any of the ranks described so far. The travelers. People like you. Visitors, pilgrims, merchants, messengers, wandering scholars, minor clergy on their way somewhere. The castle in the medieval world was also an inn, because inns were not always available and the obligation of hospitality, particularly for people of rank, was a genuine social and moral duty. You might be sleeping in the hall with a baron's esquires and a wool merchant from 3 counties away, and a monk who got caught out after dark, and a royal messenger who arrived 2 hours ago and has not yet explained his business. This, in its own way, is one of the most interesting things about sleeping in a medieval castle, the strange democracy of exhaustion. During the day, the hierarchy was visible, enforced, and absolute. At night, in the hall, with the fire dying and the bodies horizontal and the collective noise of human sleep filling the air, the differences of rank were still real and still expressed in where you lay and what you lay on. But there was also something leveling about the shared darkness, the shared cold, the shared vulnerability of sleep. Everyone in that hall, from the visiting knight on his bench to the kitchen boy on the rushes, was equally unconscious, equally unguarded, equally mortal. The lord in his solar, 2 floors above, lay in his great bed with its hangings and its feather mattress and his wife beside him and a servant at the door, and he was different from all of them in every way that the medieval world had devised to mark difference. And yet he was also, at the most fundamental level, just another person trying to get through the night. The castle holds all of them. The stone does not distinguish. The darkness is equal for everyone. You, on your section of hall floor, with the fire a dull orange glow and the person next to you already deeply asleep and the smell of everything medieval filling your nose, are part of this ancient and elaborate social machine at its most basic moment. You are horizontal. You are among the many. And you are about to discover exactly what it is that you are lying on. Whatever you were expecting to lie down on tonight, the reality is going to require a small adjustment of your expectations, downward in most senses of that word. The medieval bed, in its many forms and variations across the full spectrum of the castle's social hierarchy, is one of those subjects that historians and archaeologists have spent considerable energy reconstructing, partly because the beds themselves almost never survived and partly because what people sleep on turns out to be a surprisingly rich window into how they lived, what they valued, and what they were willing to tolerate in the name of rest. You are about to get the full tour, from the magnificent to the miserable, and by the end of it you will either have a profound new appreciation for your mattress at home or a deep suspicion that your mattress at home is not actually as good as you have been telling yourself. Let us begin where the hierarchy begins, at the top, because the Lord's bed in a well-appointed medieval castle is genuinely impressive, and giving it its proper due will make the contrast with everything below it land with the appropriate weight. The great bed of a medieval lord is a piece of furniture that modern people consistently underestimate when they encounter it in paintings or manuscript illustrations, because they tend to see it through the lens of what they already know beds to be. What they miss is the sheer scale of it. These beds were large, not California King large, but architecturally large in the way that suggested permanence and authority. The frame was typically made of oak or another hardwood, jointed and pegged together with the kind of craftsmanship that was meant to last generations, because in many cases it did. The frame supported a system of ropes or leather straps woven in a grid pattern, and this webbing was the foundation of everything that came above it. The ropes needed regular retightening. They stretched and sagged with use, which is where the old phrase sleep tight almost certainly originates, though etymologists, in their careful way, note that the evidence for this derivation is strong but not absolutely conclusive. On top of the rope or strap base went the mattress. In the grandest households, this was a feather mattress, a large linen sack stuffed with the down and feathers of geese or swans, producing a sleeping surface that was genuinely, voluptuously soft by any standard. Feather mattresses were expensive enough that they appear in wills and inventories as significant bequests, passed from parent to child with the same seriousness as land or jewelry. Below the feather mattress, in the better-equipped beds, sat a second, firmer mattress stuffed with wool or flock, the shorter fibers and scraps left over from wool processing, which provided a base layer of support so that the sleeper did not sink so far into the feathers that they became, essentially, enveloped by them. Above the feather mattress went the linen sheet, which was changed with a frequency that depended entirely on the household's resources and standards, and above that went the blankets, wool, typically, sometimes multiple layers, and then the coverlet, the decorative top layer that was as much about display as warmth. The whole ensemble was then enclosed, in the most prestigious beds, by a wooden canopy and fabric curtains hung on all four sides. This is the iconic medieval bed that you have seen in illuminated manuscripts, the tall, curtain structure that looks almost like a small room within a room, and its function was not merely decorative. The curtains served genuine practical purposes in a world where central heating was not yet even a theoretical concept. They trapped body heat, creating a microclimate within the bed that was meaningfully warmer than the air in the room around it. They provided a degree of privacy in a world where privacy was otherwise almost non-existent. They blocked drafts, which in a stone castle in winter were not a mild nuisance but a genuine physical hazard, the kind of cold, persistent air movement that could make sleeping in a room without curtains feel like sleeping outdoors. The curtains also, historians note, had a psychological function. Drawing the curtains around the bed was an act of enclosure, of creating a defined personal space in a world that offered very little of it. The lord within his curtained bed was, for the hours of the night, in a space that was entirely his or his and his wife's, which in the context of medieval marriage meant something about as private as a space could be. Historians still argue whether the development of the canopied bed in elite households reflected a growing medieval interest in personal privacy as a concept, or whether it was purely a practical response to cold and drafts, and the honest answer is that medieval people probably did not themselves distinguish between those two motivations because the concept of privacy as a distinct value had not yet been fully articulated in the way it would be in later centuries. Now step back from that magnificent structure and look at what it is sitting on. The floor of the solar, like most castle floors, is stone. The stone is cold. In winter, the cold from the stone radiates upward with a persistence that no amount of rushes or matting fully defeats, and this is why the great beds were often raised, not just on their own frames, but sometimes on low platforms, getting the sleeping surface as far from the floor as possible. The bed, in other words, was not just furniture. It was a vertical escape from the cold of the earth itself. Come down now to the middle tiers of the hierarchy, the senior household officers, the resident knights, the upper servants with their own chambers, and the beds become less elaborate but maintain the essential structure, a frame of some kind, a sleeping surface raised off the floor, some degree of covering. The mattresses in these rooms are more likely to be stuffed with wool or flock than feathers, firmer and less luxurious but functional. The coverings are simpler. The curtains, if they exist at all, are plain wool rather than embroidered silk. The room is colder because it probably does not have its own fireplace. But the person sleeping here is still sleeping in a bed, in a room with a door, and that combination of features marks them as meaningfully above the great mass of people in the hall below. In the Great Hall itself, the sleeping surfaces span a spectrum from the merely basic to the genuinely grim. The benches along the walls are, paradoxically, among the better sleeping spots available to the hall's population. They get you off the floor, which matters for warmth and matters even more when you know what the floor consists of. The rushes that covered the stone floors of medieval great halls were not simply dried grass scattered for decorative effect. They were a complex, layered accumulation of organic material, fresh rushes laid over older ones, mixed with herbs like lavender or mint or meadowsweet that were used partly for fragrance and partly as a very optimistic attempt at pest control. Beneath the fresh top layer, the rushes held the compressed history of the hall's daily life: food scraps, animal droppings from the dogs, and occasionally other animals that wandered through, spilled ale and wine, general debris of the kind that accumulates wherever large numbers of people eat and move and live. The replacement of rushes was not a daily event. In busy, well-managed households it might happen weekly, in others considerably less frequently. The 13th century scholar Alexander Neckham, describing ideal household management, recommended fresh rushes be strewn regularly, which implies strongly that the actual practice fell short of the ideal with some regularity. Historians still argue about how frequently rushes were actually changed in working medieval households, and archaeological evidence, the compressed layers found in excavations, suggests that in some cases the answer was not very often at all. Into and among these rushes went the floor sleepers, servants, lower-ranking visitors, anyone who did not merit a bench or a pallet. Their bedding was whatever they had: a cloak spread as a blanket, a rolled bundle of their own clothes as a pillow, perhaps a straw-filled sack that served as a basic mattress if they were either senior enough or organized enough to have one. The straw pallet, a simple linen or rough cloth bag stuffed with straw, was the entry-level sleeping technology of the medieval world, and it occupied a position in the domestic economy somewhat like a cheap air mattress occupies in ours: better than nothing, significantly worse than anything you would actually choose, and in need of replacement far more often than it typically received it. The straw itself was the central problem. Fresh straw is actually a reasonable sleeping material. It provides some insulation, it has a degree of give, and it smells, initially, quite pleasant in a clean agricultural way. The issue is what straw becomes over time, which is a compressed, damp, aromatic substrate that is absolutely ideal for hosting a population of insects so diverse and so committed that modern entomologists study medieval bedding sites with genuine professional admiration. Fleas were the dominant species, present in such numbers and such universality that medieval people did not really think of a flea infestation as an infestation in the modern sense. They thought of fleas the way we think of background noise, an ambient feature of existence rather than a problem to be solved. Lice were similarly universal and similarly accepted. Bedbugs, which require slightly warmer and more stable conditions than a drafty castle often provided, were more of an urban phenomenon, but in the warmer months and in the better insulated rooms, they were absolutely present. The various medical and household texts of the medieval period offer a range of suggested remedies for biting insects in bedding, ranging from the practical, certain herbs strewn in the straw were believed to repel fleas, with varying degrees of actual effectiveness, to the optimistic, specific prayers or charms that were supposed to keep the sleeper protected through the night, to the frankly creative. One category of medieval insect remedy involves instructions that are so elaborate and involve so many ingredients that one suspects the real function was to give the afflicted person something to do rather than to actually address the underlying problem. The insects, for their part, appear to have been largely unmoved by the whole effort. The wool blankets that covered all but the most destitute of the hall sleepers were themselves not innocent in this ecosystem. Wool is an excellent fiber for warmth, breathable and moisture-wicking in ways that make it genuinely superior to many modern materials, and medieval people knew this intuitively even without the vocabulary of material science to explain it. But wool is also an excellent environment for moth larvae, and the relationship between medieval woolen blankets and the insects that found them appetizing was ongoing, largely one-sided, and not in the blanket's favor. The pillows, where they existed at all, were stuffed with whatever was available. Feathers in the better households, wool flock in the middling ones, straw in the basic ones, one's own rolled-up belongings in the floor-sleeping tier. The positioning of a pillow in medieval iconography is interesting. Illuminated manuscripts consistently show sleepers with their heads elevated on what look like firmly stuffed bolsters, which suggests that the basic ergonomic preference for sleeping with the head slightly raised is genuinely ancient and cross-cultural, even if the materials used to achieve it varied enormously. There is one more element of the medieval sleeping surface that deserves mention before we leave it, partly because it is genuinely interesting and partly because it illustrates the gap between the ideal and the reality of medieval domestic life with unusual clarity. The linen sheet. Linen sheets, made from woven flax, were the standard covering for mattresses in any household with the resources to afford them. They were washed more frequently than the blankets above them, partly for hygiene and partly because they were, by the standards of the time, easier to wash. They survived the laundry process better than wool. In the finest households, sheets were bleached white and pressed, and the maintenance of white linen was a significant domestic achievement that required dedicated labor, specific knowledge, and reliable access to sunshine for the bleaching process. Below a certain level of the hierarchy, linen sheets did not exist. The servant sleeping on a straw pallet on the hall floor was sleeping directly on the pallet, covered by a wool blanket that had not been washed recently and that had been used by other people before him. The physical experience of lying down for the night in the Great Hall, at the lower end of the social spectrum, was therefore an immediate and unavoidable reminder of where you stood, or rather lay, in the world. The smell of the hall at night, if you are experiencing it for the first time, is going to take some adjustment. Wood smoke and rushes form the background notes. Over them sit the animal warmth of many bodies, the lingering smell of the evening's food, meat, bread, the specific savory richness of pottage, and beneath everything, the deep, composted smell of old rushes doing what old rushes do in the dark. You breathe it in and out. The fire has settled to coals. The straw under you is not as bad as you feared, or perhaps you are simply more tired than you realized. You shift, trying to find the position of least discomfort. Something in the straw adjusts its own position in response. You decide not to think about that. You have found your spot on the floor, negotiated a temporary truce with whatever is living in the straw, and pulled your blanket up to your chin with the resigned determination of someone who has accepted that tonight is going to be an exercise in endurance rather than restoration. But you are not ready to sleep yet. Not because you are not tired, because you are absolutely exhausted in the particular full-body way that a day of medieval travel produces, but because the castle has not finished its evening rituals, and neither, it turns out, have you. Getting ready for bed in a medieval castle is its own elaborate performance, and the script varies dramatically depending on where you sit in the hierarchy we spent the last section mapping out. For the lord in his solar, undressing for the night is a ceremony with attendants, specific garments, prayers, and a sequence of steps so formalized that deviating from it would have been noticed and remarked upon. For you on the hall floor, it is considerably more improvised. But both versions tell you something essential about how medieval people understood the body, the night, and the boundary between the public self and the private one. Let us follow the Lord first, because his bedtime routine is the most documented and the most revealing, and then we will work our way back down to your corner of the hall, where the routine is less documented but no less human. The Lord's evening has already been a long one. The Great Hall Supper, the main meal of the day in most medieval households, served in the late afternoon or early evening depending on the season and the household's customs, was both a social and a political event. The Lord sat at the high table on the dais, elevated slightly above the rest of the hall, with his family and most honored guests beside him. The meal itself was served with a ceremony that reinforced the hierarchy with every dish: who was served first, what cuts of meat went to whom, who shared a bowl with whom and who rated their own, who sat above the salt and who below it, the salt cellar placed at a specific point on the table acting as a highly visible social dividing line that is, if you think about it, one of the most elegant pieces of social engineering in culinary history. After the meal came the evening's entertainment. Music, perhaps, or a storyteller, or conversation of the kind that had political and diplomatic weight even when it appeared merely social. And then, at a point determined by the Lord's own inclination and the demands of the following day, the signal was given that the Lord was retiring. This signal rippled through the hall with remarkable speed. People who had been eating and drinking and conversing shifted immediately into the roles that the evening transition required of them. The Lord's personal attendants, his body servants, his chamberlain, the specific individuals whose job it was to manage his physical person through the most private hours, moved with him from the hall to the solar, carrying candles, carrying the items needed for the evening's preparations, moving with the quiet efficiency of people who have performed this sequence so many times that it has become automatic. The Lord walked through his own castle at night with a small procession behind him, and this procession, however modest, was itself a statement. He was attended, he was served, he was never alone in any way that diminished his dignity. In the solar, the undressing began. And here is where we need to pause, because the medieval understanding of undressing for bed was genuinely different from the modern one in ways that go beyond the obvious absence of zippers. The day garments of a medieval lord, the outer robe or tunic, the belt, the hose, the shoes, were removed with the assistance of servants whose specific job this was. This was not laziness or affectation. Some of these garments genuinely required assistance to remove, being designed with lacing or construction that made solo undressing difficult. But more than practicality, the act of being dressed and undressed by attendants was an expression of social status so deeply embedded in the culture that it barely registered as remarkable to the people involved. Being dressed by someone else meant you were important enough to have someone else dress you. The logic was circular and entirely self-confirming, which is how the best social signals work. The garments themselves were handled with care that reflected their value. Wool and silk and linen clothing in the medieval period represented significant investments, and they were stored and maintained with corresponding attention. The outer garments would be folded and placed in chests or on the backs of chairs, aired if possible, brushed free of debris. A good woolen robe, properly maintained, lasted years. Poor one, neglected, lasted considerably less. The servants who managed the Lord's wardrobe were skilled workers with specific knowledge, and their role was understood as genuinely important rather than merely menial. What the Lord wore to bed is a question that medieval sources answer with some consistency. A linen chemise or shirt, loose and long, sometimes with a cap for the head because heat loss through the skull was well understood even in the absence of modern thermodynamics. The nightcap, which later became a figure of comedy and eventually gave us the word nightcap for a final drink before bed, was in the medieval period a completely serious piece of headwear, worn by men and women of all ranks who had access to one. Linen was chosen for its softness against the skin and its washability, both important qualities in a garment that spent the night in direct contact with the body and was expected to be regularly cleaned. The wealthy slept in clean linen. The servants who helped them into it might or might not have clean linen of their own, depending on the household's resources and the Lord's attention to his staff's welfare, which varied considerably from one establishment to another. The accounts of medieval household management that survive give us occasional glimpses of lords who maintained remarkably high standards for their entire household's clothing and bedding, and other glimpses of establishments where the gap between the lord's linen and the servants was wide enough to be uncomfortable to read about. After the physical undressing came the spiritual preparation for sleep, and here we encounter one of the most consistent and genuinely moving aspects of medieval bedtime ritual: the prayers. Evening prayers were not optional, not performative, not the religious equivalent of a polite social gesture. They were understood as a necessary and protective act, a specific engagement with the spiritual forces that governed the night. The night was dangerous in the medieval understanding, not just physically dangerous, though it was certainly that, but spiritually dangerous, a time when the boundary between the material world and the world of spirits and demons was thinner and more permeable than during the day. We will spend a whole section later tonight exploring what medieval people feared in the dark and why, but for now, understanding that evening prayers were a form of spiritual armor helps explain why they were taken so seriously. The Lord would kneel at his prie-dieu and recite the prayers appropriate to the hour. Compline, the final canonical hour of the monastic day, was the model for lay evening prayers even in households that were not themselves monastic. Compline has a particular quality, liturgically. It is specifically designed to mark the surrender of the day and the committing of the self to God's protection through the coming darkness. Its texts acknowledge human vulnerability, ask for protection against the dangers of the night, and express a trust that is also, if you read it carefully, a form of controlled fear. Lord, protect us through this night. Lord, let us wake safely. Lord, let not the terrors of the dark find us. These are not the prayers of people who found the night comfortable. They are the prayers of people who understood exactly what the night could do. The lady of the castle underwent a parallel ritual in the same room, attended by her own ladies-in-waiting, those women of good family whose position in her household mirrored the esquire's position in the lord's. The ladies-in-waiting helped her undress, managed her hair. Long hair was typically braided for the night to prevent tangling, a practical consideration that has not changed at all in 800 years, assisted with her own prayers, and then settled themselves for the night in whatever arrangement the solar and its adjacent spaces allowed. The senior lady-in-waiting might have a pallet near the bed itself. Others might sleep in an outer chamber or share a room nearby. The existence of ladies-in-waiting sleeping in and around the ladies' chambers served multiple purposes simultaneously, which is very medieval: one action, multiple functions. They provided personal service through the night. They provided witnesses to the lady's whereabouts and behavior, which in the complex politics of noble marriage was not a trivial function. They provided company against the fears of the night, which were as real for the highest-ranking woman in the castle as for anyone sleeping on the hall floor. And they provided, in households where the lord was absent on campaign, on political business at another of his properties, a kind of collective female presence that was both practically useful and socially meaningful. Now come back down to the hall, because the contrast is instructive and because your own bedtime preparations are considerably less elaborate, which is either a relief or a disappointment depending on your perspective. For the people sleeping in the great hall, undressing for bed was a question of degree rather than of kind. You did not undress entirely. This was not false modesty in a communal space, though modesty was certainly a factor. It was practicality. The hall was cold, and the clothes you had been wearing all day were warmer than the alternative, which was lying in your linen chemise if you had one, or in your bare skin if you did not, exposed to a temperature that was probably somewhere between chilly and genuinely uncomfortable. Most people sleeping in the hall removed their outer layers, the heaviest robe or surcoat, the belt, possibly the shoes, and arranged them as additional covering or padding. The shoes question is interesting. Medieval shoes, particularly for people of any means, were made of leather and represented a significant financial investment. Leaving them on the floor of the great hall overnight, in a space shared with however many other people and their sticky fingers and poor visibility in the dark, was a risk. But keeping them on while you slept was uncomfortable. The solution, for those organized enough to implement it, was to tuck the shoes somewhere close to the body, under the pallet, within reach of the hand, so that both theft and loss were minimized. The number of medieval complaints about things going missing overnight in crowded sleeping spaces suggests that not everyone was this organized. Hair, for those who had covered it during the day under the caps and coifs and wimples that medieval people of both sexes wore far more consistently than modern people do, was either kept covered or let down depending on rank and available head coverings. The medieval understanding of hair as something that needed to be managed and contained during sleep, braided, covered, or otherwise secured, was consistent across the social spectrum, and the reasons given for it ranged from the practical to the magical. Loose hair attracted things, tangled inconveniently, and was in some traditions associated with spiritual vulnerability. Braiding it before sleep was both sensible and protective, which again illustrates that very medieval quality of doing one thing for several simultaneous reasons. For the servants and lower-ranking sleepers in the hall, the bedtime preparation might take only minutes. Outer garments off, something approximate to a pillow arranged, blanket pulled over, and a prayer said, either silently or in a barely audible murmur, depending on habit and exhaustion. The prayers at this level were shorter, less formal, and no less sincere. God, protect me through this night. Keep me safe until morning. These words, or words very like them, were said by virtually everyone in the castle, from the lord and his solar to the stable boy in the hay, because the night was the night and the darkness was the darkness, and the prayers were not about rank but about the human relationship with vulnerability. What was not done in the medieval bedtime routine at any level of the hierarchy was washing. Not in the modern sense, not as part of a nightly ritual. The concept of washing before bed as a regular practice is a much more recent development than most people assume. Medieval bathing existed. We should dispatch immediately the myth that medieval people never bathed, because they did, and some classes bathed with some regularity, but it was not a nightly ritual. And it was certainly not something the average hall sleeper was going to manage with the castle's water supply and the available facilities. What medieval people did do, consistently, was what we might call grooming as social performance. The arrangement of hair, the care of outer garments, the maintenance of the visible public body. The private body, the nighttime body, was a different matter, and the relationship between the two, between the carefully managed daytime self and the necessarily less controlled sleeping self, is one of the more interesting tensions in medieval domestic culture. You pull your cloak more tightly around yourself. You have said your prayer quickly and quietly, because some habits are ancient and need no explanation. The hall is settling. The fire has gone down further. The voices that were still murmuring a few minutes ago have mostly fallen silent. In the cold air above you, the smoke from the dying fire drifts in slow spirals toward the high ceiling, and whatever gaps in the stone let the outside in. You close your eyes, and the castle, enormous and dark and full of breathing people, holds you in its stone hands and does not let go. The moment your eyes close is, of course, the moment the castle decides to remind you that it has absolutely no interest in being quiet. This is not a malfunction. This is not bad luck. This is simply the medieval castle at night doing exactly what it has always done, which is to say, continuing to exist as a fully operational living system that does not pause its operations because the humans inside it would prefer it to. The sounds and smells and occasional alarming physical sensations of the castle after dark are not interruptions to the night. They are the night, and learning to sleep through them, or with them, or despite them, is one of the fundamental survival skills of castle life that nobody puts on the recruitment poster, but everyone who lives here has had to acquire. Let us begin with the sounds, because they are the most immediately present feature of your experience right now, layered over each other in a way that your modern ears, accustomed to the managed acoustic environments of insulated buildings and electronic white noise, are going to find simultaneously fascinating and deeply unhelpful for sleep. The fire is the baseline. Even reduced to coals and carefully banked for the night, a large hearth in a stone room produces a continuous, low-level acoustic presence. The occasional tick and settle of cooling embers, the soft collapse of a piece of wood that has finally finished burning, the almost imperceptible hiss of moisture being driven out of the stone around the fireplace by the residual heat. This is the sound you will eventually come to find comforting, because it is consistent and because it represents warmth, and warmth at night in a medieval castle is a genuinely good thing that deserves whatever comfort it can offer. Over the fire's baseline come the sounds of the people around you. The great hall at night, filled with sleeping bodies, produces a soundscape that is specific and unforgettable. Snoring is the dominant note. Medieval snoring, we have no particular reason to believe, was any different from modern snoring, and the aggregate effect of 30 or 40 people in various stages of sleep-related respiratory activity is a complex, unpredictable music that occasionally reaches impressive volumes. There is a figure sleeping 6 feet to your left who appears to be attempting to communicate something important to the spirit world through his nasal passages, and the message, whatever it is being transmitted with great urgency. Beneath the snoring are the smaller sounds. The shift of a body turning over, the rustle of straw beneath a pallet, a cough muffled into a sleeve, someone's murmured response to whatever their dreaming mind is showing them. Occasionally someone gets up, to relieve themselves, usually, because the hall does not have private facilities and the arrangements for nighttime bodily functions are a pragmatic feature of castle life that we will address without excessive delicacy, since the medieval world addressed them without any delicacy at all. There were chamber pots in the better rooms. In the hall, the options included designated areas near the exterior walls, the garderobes or privies built into the castle walls if they were accessible from the hall, or, in moments of particular urgency or particular laziness, whatever outdoor space could be reached through the available exits. The nighttime movement of people through the hall for this purpose was so routine that it barely registered, except when someone tripped over you on the way, which happened. The dogs have not been fully removed. There are always a few dogs that have managed to remain in the hall through a combination of stealth and the specific talent that dogs have always had for making themselves seem like someone else's responsibility. They shift and scratch and occasionally produce the deep, involuntary whimpers of dogs in active dream states, presumably chasing something through a landscape accessible only to them. One has settled against your legs, which you did not invite but are not going to refuse because it is warm. Now add to this interior soundscape the sounds that come from outside the hall, filtered through the stone walls and the high windows and the general mass of the castle itself. The night watch is the most regular of these. The guards who patrol the walls and the interior of the castle through the darkness move on a circuit, and you can track their progress by the sound of their footsteps on the stone, the occasional clank of their equipment, and the verbal challenges that pass between them at certain points in the patrol, the call and response signals that confirm identity and position and alert everyone within earshot that the watch is functioning. These sounds are deliberately audible. A silent watch is a watch that might have fallen asleep or been incapacitated, and the audible presence of the guards is itself a form of security, a reassurance to the sleeping castle that someone is awake and paying attention. The guards also carried, in many castle traditions, a horn or bell that was used to raise the alarm in case of emergency. The specific sound of this alarm, which you have not heard tonight and hopefully will not hear, was one of the most terrifying sounds in the medieval acoustic environment because it meant fire or attack or both, and the response it triggered was immediate, total, and not gentle in its treatment of anyone who was slow to wake. Fire is the fear that underlies everything about the medieval castle at night. It sits beneath the surface of every precaution: the curfew bell, the careful banking of the hearth, the prohibition on leaving candles unattended, the guards specifically tasked with watching for smoke, like a deep current under calm water. And the fear is entirely rational, because the castle, for all its stone construction, was not fireproof. The roofs of many buildings within the castle enclosure were wood and thatch. The interior furnishings, the tapestries, the wooden furniture, the straw pallets, the wool blankets, the clothing, were combustible in the ordinary sense of the word. The great hall itself, with its high wooden ceiling and its history of fires maintained through every evening, was a structure that had already survived many fires and would, statistically, not survive all of them. Medieval castle fires were not rare. The historical record is full of them, from minor incidents that were caught early and extinguished with relatively minor damage, to catastrophic events that destroyed entire sections of castles that had stood for generations. The word conflagration exists in the English language because the Latin it came from was used regularly to describe real events, and the specificity of medieval fire-related vocabulary, the different terms for different types and scales of fire, suggests a culture that thought about fire with the focused attention of people for whom it was a constant, concrete concern. This is why the person who wakes from deep sleep in a medieval castle and smells something burning does not roll over and go back to sleep. They sit up, they look around, they make a determination, quickly, about whether the smell is the normal ambient smoke of a banked hearth or something different, something sharper or stronger or coming from an unexpected direction. This skill, the ability to distinguish between the ordinary smell of a castle at night and the smell of something that should not be burning, was a genuine survival skill, and people who lived in castles developed it the way people who live near the sea developed the ability to read weather. Beyond fire, the fears of the medieval night extended in directions that are both practical and metaphysical, and the two categories were considerably less separate in the medieval mind than they are in ours. The practical fears are easy to enumerate: intruders, thieves, attackers, the various human threats that the castle's defenses were designed to address. The castle's walls and gates and guards were responses to real threats, and the knowledge that those defenses could, in principle, be overcome was a background anxiety that everyone who lived within them carried. A castle that had never been attacked was a castle that had not yet been attacked, and the distinction mattered. But alongside the practical fears sat the spiritual and supernatural ones, which were not considered a separate category by the people experiencing them. The medieval night was populated, in the common understanding of the time, by forces that were neither human nor animal, spirits, demons, the souls of the dead who had not found their proper rest, and a whole taxonomy of supernatural entities whose specific natures and behaviors were debated by theologians, described in popular stories, and feared by ordinary people with a consistency and an intensity that tells us the fear was real even where the entities were not. The most commonly feared nighttime supernatural entity in the medieval European tradition was something that contemporary sources describe with various names, but that modern scholars generally categorize under the broad heading of night demons or night spirits, beings that came to sleeping people and afflicted them in ways that ranged from disturbing dreams to physical assault. The phenomenon we now recognize as sleep paralysis, the experience of waking in a state of temporary muscular paralysis, often accompanied by a sense of a heavy presence on the chest or in the room, was experienced by medieval people as a literal supernatural attack. The creature responsible was known by different names in different traditions: the Mara in Germanic and Scandinavian cultures, the cauchemar in French, entities that sat on the sleeper's chest and pressed the breath out of them. The word nightmare preserves this creature, the nightmare, the spirit that rides the sleeper, in our modern vocabulary, which is a genuinely lovely piece of etymological archaeology if you are the kind of person who finds that sort of thing lovely. Tonight, alone on the hall floor with the darkness pressing in, you might find it slightly less charming. The practical responses to these supernatural fears were numerous, varied, and often combined spiritual and physical elements in ways that made complete sense within the medieval understanding of how the world worked. Certain herbs, vervain, St. John's wort, mugwort, were believed to protect sleeping spaces from malevolent spirits. Iron, particularly iron in the form of a knife or tool placed near the bed, was widely understood to repel supernatural entities of various kinds. The specific prayers of Compline, as mentioned earlier, were understood as spiritual protection against the dangers of the night, and their regular use was considered genuinely prophylactic rather than merely devotional. The smell of the castle at night, which you have been breathing in since you lay down, has its own story to tell about how the medieval world managed its environment. Wood smoke is everywhere, not just the residual smoke from the evening's fires, but the accumulated smoke of years embedded in the stone and timber of the building itself. Stone castles that have been occupied for decades absorb smoke into their walls in a way that becomes a permanent feature of their character, and the specific smell of old, cold wood smoke is one of the most historically evocative smells that survives in restored or preserved medieval buildings today. Over the smoke, the rushes, which we have already discussed, and their complex organic contribution to the olfactory landscape. The animals, horses from the stable outside, dogs in the hall, the occasional other creature that has wandered in, add their own notes, familiar to anyone who has spent time around livestock and deeply surprising to those who have not. The food from the evening meal lingers in the hall air in a form that is more pleasant than the rushes, the fatty richness of roasted meat, the yeasty warmth of bread, the herbal complexity of the spiced wine or ale that was the standard drink at table, but which is, by this point in the evening, moving from appetizing into something more ambiguous. And then there is the smell of the people themselves, which requires a moment of honest engagement. Medieval people in the castle were not uniformly unwashed. We established this earlier, and the point bears reiterating. But neither were they washed with the frequency that modern people are, and a large number of them in a warm enclosed space, after a day of physical activity, produce a smell that is entirely human and entirely accurate and entirely part of the sensory experience of being here. It is not, if you breathe it honestly, the overwhelming assault that modern imagination tends to assume. It is simply the smell of people warm, dense, and close, which is a smell that has its own strange intimacy, a reminder that you are surrounded by living bodies, that you are not alone in this dark, that the breathing you hear on all sides is real and present and human. Something in the wall above you makes a sound, a scraping, intermittent sound that stops and starts with no discernible pattern. You stare at the ceiling in the dim orange light of the coals and try to determine what is making that noise, running through the available options. Rat, mouse, bird roosting in a gap in the stonework, loose piece of mortar, something that has gotten into the space between the inner and outer wall, and settle on rat as the most probable, which is both the most reassuring and the least reassuring conclusion simultaneously. The guard's footsteps pass outside, steady and deliberate. The sound of someone who is awake by professional obligation and performing wakefulness for the benefit of everyone else. The sound fades, returns, fades again on the next circuit. The fire exhales softly. The snorer to your left has, inexplicably, stopped snoring, which is somehow more alarming than the snoring was. You lie in the dark and listen to the castle breathe, and you understand, in a way that is very physical and very immediate, why medieval people did not consider night to be simply the absence of day. They considered it a different country entirely, with its own rules and its own dangers and its own population of things that did not walk in the light. You are a visitor in that country now. The question of whether you sleep at all is still open. Somewhere in the depths of the night, something unexpected happens. You sleep. Not the shallow, restless half-sleep you expected. Not the grim endurance exercise of lying still and waiting for morning, but actual, genuine, deep sleep, the kind that pulls you under completely and holds you there in the warm dark of unconsciousness with a firmness that surprises you when you eventually surface from it. And then, at some point that feels like the middle of everything, you wake up. Not because of the snoring, which has resumed with its earlier enthusiasm. Not because of the rat in the wall, which is still conducting its inscrutable investigation of the stonework. Not because of any external disturbance at all, really, but simply because your body has decided, with an authority that overrides your preference for remaining unconscious, that it is time to be awake. You lie there for a moment, confused. The hall is dark. Darker than it was when you fell asleep, because the fire has burned lower and the thin light of whatever moon exists tonight is not making much impression through the high windows. The sounds around you are the sounds of deep collective sleep. The long, slow respirations of people in the furthest reaches of unconsciousness, the occasional shift and murmur, the dog against your legs still warm and entirely unbothered by the hour. You feel strangely alert, not groggy in the way you might expect from being woken in the middle of the night, alert in a different way, a calm and functional way, as though this wakefulness is not an interruption but an arrival, as though this is exactly where you were supposed to be. Welcome to the first sleep. Or rather, welcome to the end of it. What you are experiencing, this natural, unforced waking in what we would calculate to be the middle of the night, is not insomnia. It is not a malfunction of your sleep cycle. It is, in fact, the most historically normal sleep pattern in the human record. And the fact that it feels strange to you is a measure not of anything wrong with you, but of how thoroughly the Industrial Revolution reorganized human sleep without anyone really noticing or consenting to the reorganization. The concept of segmented sleep, sleeping in two distinct periods separated by an interval of wakefulness, is one of those historical discoveries that, once you encounter it, immediately rearranges a lot of things you thought you understood about both history and yourself. The historian Roger Kirch spent decades researching pre-industrial sleep patterns and accumulated an extraordinary body of evidence, from medical texts, court records, diaries, literature, and practical manuals, demonstrating that biphasic sleep, sleeping in two segments with a waking interval between them, was the dominant pattern of human sleep throughout most of recorded history, at least in the Western world. The first sleep, or first sleep as contemporary sources called it with a directness that implies everyone knew exactly what the term meant, typically lasted several hours after dark. Then came the interval, the watch, the wakeful period between the two sleeps. Then the second sleep, which lasted until morning. The interval between the two sleeps, in the accounts that survive, lasted roughly an hour to an hour and a half, and it was not considered wasted time. It was, in fact, understood as a period with its own specific qualities and its own appropriate activities, and the list of things that medieval people did during this interval is one of the more unexpectedly humanizing details in the entire landscape of historical sleep research. People talked. Couples made love. People prayed. The night offices of the monastic schedule, the matins and lauds that were sung in the small hours, mapped onto this natural waking interval with a precision that was not coincidental. People thought. The medieval medical tradition, drawing on classical sources that understood sleep physiology in their own vocabulary, held that the period between the two sleeps was one of unusual mental clarity, a time when the mind was freed from the distractions of the day and the fog of deep sleep simultaneously, suspended in a state of gentle, productive wakefulness. Historians still argue whether biphasic sleep was genuinely universal in the pre-industrial world, or whether it was more prevalent in certain latitudes and seasons, the long winter nights of northern Europe providing more darkness than a single sleep period needed to fill, which might have created the biphasic pattern as a practical adaptation rather than a biological given. The archaeological and medical evidence suggests it was extremely widespread, but extremely widespread and universal are different claims, and the honest position is that human sleep patterns across history were probably more varied than any single model captures. What is striking about the medieval evidence specifically is how unselfconscious it is. People refer to the first sleep and the second sleep in passing, in texts that are about other things entirely, the way you might mention breakfast in a letter about something else, not as a curiosity or a novelty but as an obvious feature of the day that requires no explanation. A court record might note that something happened after his first sleep. A medical text might prescribe a remedy to be taken between sleeps. A poem might set its action in the hour between the first and second sleep. The casualness of these references is the most compelling evidence of all. You do not casually mention something that is unusual. You casually mention something that everyone already knows. The dissolution of this pattern is one of the most significant and least discussed changes in European daily life, and its timing is remarkably precise. The biphasic sleep pattern begins to disappear from the written record in the late 17th century, and it is largely gone by the end of the 18th. The mechanism of its disappearance is almost certainly artificial lighting. As candles became cheaper, as street lighting spread through European cities, as the culture of evening sociability expanded, coffee houses, theaters, social visiting that extended later and later into what had previously been sleeping hours, the period of darkness available for sleep shrank. When the available darkness is 8 hours rather than 12 or 14, you do not have the luxury of 2 sleep periods with a waking interval. You have 1 sleep period, and you fill it as completely as you can. The Industrial Revolution then completed the transformation by imposing the regulated working day. Specific start times, specific end times, the clock as the governing authority over human activity, which required a sleep pattern that delivered workers to their stations at a predictable hour, reliably awake and functional. The single consolidated sleep period, from a fixed bedtime to a fixed waking time, was not a natural human discovery. It was an industrial product, engineered by economic necessity and enabled by artificial light, and it has been the standard Western sleep model for only about 300 years, which is a remarkably short time in the context of human history. The consequence of this history is that a meaningful portion of the modern population experiences what sleep researchers now call sleep maintenance insomnia. Waking in the middle of the night and being unable to return to sleep, and treats it as a pathology requiring intervention. And some of it genuinely is a pathology caused by stress or anxiety or medical conditions that deserve attention and treatment. But some portion of it, the calm, alert waking in the middle of the night that does not feel anxious or distressing, the kind that feels like an arrival rather than an interruption, may simply be the ancient biphasic pattern asserting itself against the artificial schedule imposed on it. You are lying awake in the middle of the night in a medieval castle and feeling strangely fine about it. And the reason you feel strangely fine about it is that your body has been waiting for this permission for 300 years. In the castle around you, other people are also awake in their intervals, and the things they are doing illuminate the medieval night in ways that are both intimate and surprising. Up in the solar, the Lord and his wife are, according to the medical advice of the period, engaged in activities that the physicians of the time specifically recommended for the interval between sleeps. Medieval medical thinking, drawing on Galenic theory, held that the body's processes during the first sleep, the digestion of the evening meal, the processing of the day's experiences, left the body in a state of warmth and readiness during the waking interval that made it particularly receptive to conception. This was not folk belief. It was the considered medical opinion of educated physicians, and it shaped the timing of marital relations in ways that were understood as both practical and medically sound. The association between the interval between sleeps and sexual activity is consistent enough in medieval sources that historians treat it as a genuine pattern of behavior rather than a literary convention. In the chapel, if the castle has one of sufficient size and staff to maintain the night offices, and the larger castles did, a priest or chaplain is performing matins, the office of the night watch, a service that was specifically designed to be sung in the darkness between the 2 sleeps. The sound of matins, if it reaches you in the hall, is one of the stranger and more beautiful sounds of the castle night. Plain chant in the dark, voices rising and falling in a building full of sleeping people, the liturgical acknowledgement that the night is not empty, that the hours between midnight and dawn are watched and named and held within a sacred structure. In the kitchen, which never truly goes cold in an active castle, a night cook or a servant on kitchen duty tends the fires that must be maintained for the early morning's work. The bread that will be served at tomorrow's meals is already proving, the dough risen and covered in the warmth near the hearth. The kitchen at night has a particular quality, warmer than the hall, smelling of yeast and old fat and the specific mineral richness of a hearth that has been burning continuously for months. and occupied by a tired person doing a solitary job that does not require conversation and therefore does not get any. In the stables, the horses shift in their stalls with the slow, weighty movements of large animals who are also in their own version of this interval. Not deeply asleep, not fully awake, moving through the night in a mode that is different from both. The groom who is awake in the stable. There is always someone awake in the stable, because horses are expensive and horses can injure themselves, and the night is when both of those facts are most relevant. Sits in the warm hay and does whatever solitary humans do in the company of sleeping animals in the middle of the night, which is probably think. The guards on the walls are fully awake, or are supposed to be, and the specific challenge of maintaining wakefulness through the coldest and darkest hours of the night is one that military organizations throughout history have addressed with varying success. The medieval solution combined regular patrol circuits, the movement itself helping to maintain alertness, with the call and response verbal challenges between posts, which served as both security measure and mutual wakefulness check. A guard who failed to respond to the challenge was either incapacitated or asleep, and neither of those conditions was acceptable. The penalties for sleeping on watch in a medieval military context were severe enough that they presumably served as a motivational supplement to the cold air and the walking. You lie in your interval wakefulness and listen to all of this. The faint chant from the chapel if it reaches you, the guard's circuit, the horses, the breathing of the hall, and you feel the particular quality of this hour that the medieval sources describe and that you are now experiencing directly. There is a stillness to it that is different from the stillness of the deep sleep hours. It is a stillness that is populated, inhabited, aware. The night is not empty. It is full of people doing the things that people do when the day has paused but not ended, when the body has rested enough to think but not enough to start again. The medieval monk who sang matins in the dark understood this. The physician who prescribed the interval for marital relations understood this. The lord lying awake in his curtained bed, thinking the thoughts that the day had not allowed him time for, understood this. The servant in the kitchen watching the bread rise understood this. And you, lying on your straw pallet in the dying warmth of the great hall, understand this. The night is not an absence. It is a country with its own terrain, and you are somewhere in the middle of it now, in the interval between one shore and the other, suspended in a wakefulness that is genuinely ancient and genuinely yours. After a while, it might be an hour, it might be slightly more, the quality of the darkness begins to shift, almost imperceptibly, toward something that is not yet lighter but is somehow less dense. The second sleep is coming. You can feel it at the edges of your consciousness, a gentle gravitational pull toward unconsciousness that is different from the exhaustion you felt when you first lay down. This is not collapse. This is descent. You pull the blanket up. The dog against your legs adjusts without waking. The hall breathes around you in its many-voiced way, and you go down into the second sleep like a stone into still water, smooth and complete and entirely without resistance. The second sleep is different from the first. You probably noticed this even as you were entering it, a quality to the descent that was softer, less urgent, more like being welcomed than being dragged. The first sleep is the sleep of exhaustion, the body asserting its needs with the blunt authority of a creditor collecting a debt. The second sleep is something else. More permeable, more strange, closer to the surface of consciousness even as it takes you deeper into its own territory. And it is in the second sleep, in this particular quality of suspended awareness, that the dreams come. Not the fragmented, quickly forgotten flickers that sometimes visit the first sleep, but the long, coherent, narratively complex dreams that feel, while you are in them, absolutely and urgently real. You are dreaming now. You may not know what you are dreaming, but the medieval world around you has very specific ideas about what your dream means, where it came from, and what, if anything, you are obligated to do about it. The medieval understanding of dreams is one of those subjects that looks simple from a distance and turns out, on closer examination, to be a layered, contested, and philosophically rich tradition that draws simultaneously on classical Greek and Roman thought, Christian theology, Jewish mystical traditions, popular folk belief, and the practical observations of physicians who were trying to use dreams diagnostically. The result is not a single coherent theory but a lively, sometimes contradictory conversation that was conducted across centuries and that involved some of the most sophisticated thinkers of the medieval world. If you think the modern debate about what dreams mean is complicated, the medieval version was doing it without neuroscience and with considerably higher stakes, because the medieval position, widely held, seriously argued, and practically consequential, was that some dreams were messages from God. The foundational framework that most medieval thinkers worked within came largely from Macrobius, a 5th-century commentator whose analysis of a dream in Cicero's Republic became one of the most influential texts on dreams in the medieval period. Macrobius proposed a taxonomy of dream types that organized the chaotic variety of nocturnal experience into categories with different sources and different significances. The somnium was the true prophetic dream, symbolic and requiring interpretation. The visio was a straightforward prophetic vision, showing future events directly. The oraculum was a dream in which a divine or authoritative figure appeared and delivered a message. These three types were considered meaningful, worth attending to, worth recording and interpreting. The insomnium was a dream caused by the day's preoccupations, anxiety, desire, unresolved concerns, and was considered meaningless, a kind of mental housekeeping with no prophetic content. The visum was the dream that accompanied the hypnagogic state, the threshold between waking and sleep, and was treated with particular caution because it was associated with supernatural visitation and was considered potentially dangerous. The question of which category a given dream belonged to was not always easy to answer, and the medieval literature on dream interpretation reflects this difficulty with an anxiety that is almost modern in its intensity. How do you know if your dream is a message from God or a product of last night's supper? How do you distinguish divine communication from demonic deception? These were not abstract theological puzzles. They were practical problems faced by people who woke from vivid dreams in the small hours and needed to decide whether they were obligated to act on what they had seen. The demonic dream, the dream sent by evil spirits to mislead, corrupt, or terrify the dreamer, was a genuine concern in medieval spiritual life, and the vulnerability of the sleeping person to spiritual attack was taken seriously at every level of the Church's teaching. The sleeping body, in the medieval theological understanding, was a body in which the rational soul had temporarily relaxed its governance, and this relaxation created an opening through which malevolent forces could enter. The dreams sent by demons were characterized, in the literature, by their intensity, their vividness, their appeal to desire or fear, and their tendency to present things that were false as though they were true. A demon could, in this understanding, appear in a dream in the form of a trusted person or a divine messenger, and the discernment of true divine communication from demonic mimicry was a skill that the most sophisticated medieval spiritual directors devoted considerable attention to developing. The practical consequence of all this was that medieval people woke from disturbing dreams with a set of responses that were specific, traditional, and understood as genuinely protective. Prayer was the first and most important response. Specifically, the prayers that addressed the spiritual forces of the night directly, asking for their removal and asking for divine protection. The sign of the cross made over the body was understood as a physical seal against spiritual intrusion, and the speed with which a disturbed sleeper made this sign upon waking, before fully gathering their thoughts, before speaking, before doing anything else, reflects how seriously the danger was taken. The logic was that the demonic force that had been present in the dream might still be present in the room, and the cross was the most immediate available defense. Historians still argue whether the medieval experience of night terrors and demonic dreams represents a genuine difference in the subjective experience of sleep across cultures, or whether the same neurological experiences that we interpret through the lens of sleep science were being interpreted through the lens of medieval theology, with the content of the supernatural cast changing while the underlying experience remained constant. The sleep paralysis that medieval people experienced as a demon sitting on their chest, the hypnagogic hallucinations that they saw as spiritual presences, the vivid and emotionally intense dreams that felt like communication, these experiences are documented in modern sleep research as entirely neurological phenomena. But the medieval person experiencing them had no neurological framework and a very well-developed theological one, and the framework shapes the experience as much as the experience shapes the framework. The positive dream, the dream understood as divine communication or prophetic vision, carried its own obligations and its own anxieties. Biblical precedent was overwhelming on this point. Dreams had been the medium through which God spoke to patriarchs, prophets, and kings throughout the Old Testament, and the New Testament continued the pattern. Joseph's dreams about Mary. The Magi warned in a dream not to return to Herod. The entire early Christian tradition was saturated with meaningful dreams, and the medieval church could not simply dismiss dreams as neurological noise without dismissing a significant portion of its own foundational narrative. The result was a careful, sometimes tortured negotiation between taking dreams seriously and not taking them too seriously, between honoring the prophetic tradition and guarding against the spiritual dangers of excessive credulity. The official position, developed by theologians from Augustine through Aquinas, was essentially, some dreams are meaningful, most are not. The meaningful ones are rare and their interpretation requires caution and spiritual guidance. And you should not make major life decisions based on dreams without consulting someone qualified to help you discern their source and significance. The unofficial position, which coexisted with the theological one in the actual daily life of medieval people at every social level, was considerably more enthusiastic about dreams as a source of practical guidance. And the dream interpretation manuals that circulated in medieval Europe, the Somnial Danielis, attributed to the prophet Daniel and containing interpretations for hundreds of different dream images, was one of the most copied texts in the medieval period, suggest a popular appetite for dream interpretation that was not much constrained by theological caution. These manuals are extraordinary documents, partly for their content and partly for what they reveal about medieval imaginative life. They contain interpretations for dreams about specific objects, animals, actions, and situations, organized in ways that reflect the concerns of their audiences. Dreams about crops and weather for agricultural communities, dreams about journeys and roads for travelers, dreams about enemies and allies for the politically engaged. The interpretations are not consistent across different versions of the manual, which suggests either that the tradition was genuinely diverse or that copyists felt comfortable updating the interpretations to reflect their own community's concerns, or both. Historians still argue about the relationship between the different versions of the Somnial Danielis and what that relationship tells us about how medieval people actually used dream interpretation as a practical tool. The castle, specifically, had its own dream culture that was shaped by its particular social environment. The lord who dreamed of battle, of treachery, of the loss of his lands, was dreaming the specific anxieties of his specific position, and the advisors and chaplains who helped him interpret those dreams were doing a form of political as well as spiritual work. A lord who believed he had received a divine warning in a dream might change his military plans, delay a journey, reconsider an alliance. The dream became a participant in the politics of the waking world, which gave dream interpretation a practical urgency that went well beyond personal spiritual development. The women of the castle had their own dream traditions, some of which overlapped with the men's and some of which were specific to their concerns. Dreams about pregnancy and childbirth were interpreted with particular attention and particular anxiety, given that childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women of all ranks and the production of heirs was both a personal and a dynastic concern. A pregnant noblewoman who dreamed about the sex or character of her unborn child was not engaging in mere fantasy. She was gathering information from a source that her culture considered potentially reliable, and the people around her took those dreams seriously as data. The servants sleeping in the hall had their own relationship with dreams, shaped by the folk traditions that ran parallel to and sometimes below the theological framework. Where the Lord's chaplain offered Macrobius and Augustine, the castle's old cook offered the dream lore of her grandmother, which had its own taxonomy and its own interpretive logic and was, from the perspective of the people who used it, entirely adequate to the task. Dreams about teeth falling out meant death in the family. Dreams about flying meant good fortune. Dreams about water meant change, and the nature of the change depended on whether the water was clear or murky, still or moving. These folk interpretations were not considered spiritually respectable by the Church, which periodically condemned dream divination as a form of superstition that bordered on the demonic. The condemnations were issued with a regularity that tells you the practice was widespread enough to be worth condemning, and the widespread nature of the practice tells you the condemnations were not particularly effective. People had always looked for meaning in dreams and always would, and the theological framework that said most dreams were meaningless housekeeping was fighting an uphill battle against the lived experience of vivid, emotionally powerful nocturnal narratives that felt absolutely full of meaning. Against all of this, the prophetic dreams and the demonic terrors and the folk interpretations and the theological cautions, The medieval castle deployed its protective arsenal with a thoroughness that reflected genuine conviction. The prayers of Compline were one layer. The physical objects placed near the sleeping body, iron, specific herbs, amulets that occupied an uncomfortable theological gray area between acceptable devotional objects and condemned magical charms, were another. The sign of the cross made before sleep and upon waking was a third. And then there were the specific prayers and charms against nightmare that circulated in medieval devotional literature and that were, regardless of their official theological status, clearly used by large numbers of people. One category of these protective texts involved addressing the night terror directly, naming it and commanding it to leave, an approach that combines the logic of exorcism with the logic of confrontation and that reflects the medieval understanding that naming a thing, knowing its name, gave you power over it. Another category involved constructing, through prayer or ritual action, a kind of spiritual boundary around the sleeping space, a perimeter of sacred protection that the demonic could not cross. The specific form of these protective boundaries varied by region, by religious community, and by the folk tradition of the individual practitioner, but the underlying logic that the sleeping self needed and could receive active spiritual protection against the dangers of the night was consistent across all of them. You surface slightly from your second sleep, not fully awake, hovering in the permeable threshold state that the medieval sources called the visum and that modern sleep science calls the hypnagogic or hypnopompic state, depending on whether you are entering or leaving sleep. In this state, the boundary between dreaming and perceiving is genuinely unclear, and the things you see or sense in it have a quality that is different from both ordinary dreams and ordinary waking experience. More immediate, more present, more difficult to dismiss. There is something in the corner of the hall. You cannot see it clearly, the light is too low, the hall too dark. But there is a quality to the shadow in that corner that is different from the other shadows. You are not fully awake. You cannot be sure of anything you are perceiving. The rational part of your mind, the modern part, assembles the available evidence. Low light, fatigue, the hypnagogic state, the stories you have been absorbing about demonic night visitors, pattern recognition working overtime in a genuinely ambiguous visual environment. The medieval part of you, the part that this night has been slowly awakening, the part that understands darkness as a country with its own population, makes the sign of the cross before you are even fully aware of deciding to do so. The corner is just a corner. You breathe out. The hall breathes with you. The second sleep draws you back down, and you go because the morning is still a long way off and your body knows it, and because the protective prayers have been said and the sign has been made and the night, for all its strangeness, has not yet offered you anything you cannot survive. The corner, as established, was just a corner. You are back in the second sleep now, deep and dark and blessedly dreamless for the moment, and the hall has settled into the particular stillness of the hours just before dawn when even the most committed snorers have found a rhythm and the dogs have stopped adjusting themselves and the fire is at its absolute lowest, a bed of coals that gives off heat but almost no light, so that the hall exists in a darkness that is as close to total as the medieval castle ever gets. And into this darkness, into this deepest and most anonymous hour, comes the fact about medieval sleeping arrangements that we have been circling around since the beginning of this night without quite landing on it directly. You are not sleeping alone. You knew this, of course. The hall is full of people. You have been aware of them all night. Their sounds and smells and movements have been the constant texture of your experience. But what you may not have fully registered yet is the specific, physical, entirely normalized fact that several of the people in this hall are sharing not just a room but an actual bed, an actual pallet, an actual sleeping surface, in combinations that would require considerable explanation in a modern context and that required no explanation whatsoever in the medieval one. Bed sharing in the medieval world was not an intimacy. It was a practicality. It was, in fact, so thoroughly ordinary at every level of the social hierarchy that the absence of a bed partner was the unusual condition requiring comment, not the presence of one. Let us be precise about what we mean, because the modern imagination tends to run immediately to conclusions that the medieval reality does not entirely support. Bed sharing in the medieval period was not primarily sexual in its motivation or its social meaning. It was thermal, economic, and social simultaneously, in proportions that varied depending on context. And the modern habit of reading sexual implication into any physical proximity between bodies is a historical projection that tells us more about our own cultural assumptions than about medieval life. Medieval people had a perfectly functional concept of sexual behavior and its appropriate context. They also had a perfectly functional concept of sleeping next to someone for warmth without any sexual dimension whatsoever, and they practiced both without apparent confusion about which was which. The thermal logic is the most straightforward. A medieval castle in winter was cold in ways that the modern thermostat has made very difficult to viscerally imagine. The fires that heated the Great Hall and the solar were real and meaningful, but they did not heat the way a modern central heating system heats, evenly, continuously, maintaining a stable temperature throughout the space regardless of what was happening outdoors. Medieval heating was local and directional. Warm near the fire, cold away from it, and the cold was not abstract. It was the kind of cold that made your extremities ache, that made sleep difficult and waking painful, that was a genuine medical hazard for the very young and the very old and anyone already in poor health. Two bodies under a wool blanket were meaningfully warmer than one body under the same blanket, and in a world where warmth was a survival resource rather than a comfort preference, this was not a trivial consideration. The economic logic reinforced the thermal one. Beds were expensive. The great bed of the Lord with its frame and ropes and mattresses and hangings represented a capital investment that was significant even by aristocratic standards, and at lower levels of the hierarchy. A decent pallet and a wool blanket were possessions that most households could not multiply indefinitely. Space was also a limited resource. Castle rooms were not generous by modern standards, even the better ones, and the Great Hall's floor space was finite. Sharing a sleeping surface was in many contexts simply what you did with the available resources, without any more social significance than sharing a table at a meal. And then there was the social dimension, which in the medieval world was woven so thoroughly into the physical arrangements of daily life that separating it out feels artificial. Who you shared a bed with was a statement about your relationships, your loyalties, your social position, and your trust, not primarily a statement about your sexuality. The esquires who shared pallets in the hall were simultaneously sleeping companions and colleagues in training, and the physical proximity of shared sleep was part of the social bonding of the household in the same way that shared meals were. The ladies-in-waiting who slept near the lady of the castle were not merely convenient sleeping companions. They were witnesses, companions, confidants, and the intimacy of shared sleep space was part of what made them trustworthy in their role. The Lord's bed, despite being the most private sleeping space in the castle, was itself a shared space in ways that went beyond the marital sharing we have already discussed. In the most elevated households, the ceremonial putting to bed that attended great occasions, the first night of a marriage, the reception of a royal guest, involved the bed being witnessed and blessed in ways that made it a semi-public space even at its most intimate. The bed of a great lord was also, in the tradition of royal and aristocratic sleeping, attended, a body servant slept nearby, as we established, and in some of the grandest households the practice of the gentleman of the bedchamber meant that senior household officers took turns sleeping in or adjacent to the Lord's chamber as a matter of protocol and security. Come down from the solar and consider the sleeping arrangements of the senior household officers, the steward, the marshal, the chamberlain, and their equivalents, and you find a middle tier of sharing that was organized around both rank and function. Two officers of similar standing might share a chamber and a bed as a matter of straightforward practicality, with no social meaning attached beyond the obvious one that they were colleagues of equivalent rank who happened to be using the same room. A senior officer might have a junior assistant sleeping on a pallet in the same room, available for nighttime needs in the way that the Lord's body servant was available for the Lord's nighttime needs, but at a less ceremonially elaborated level. The gradations of sharing were as precisely calibrated as the gradations of the hierarchy they expressed, which by now should not surprise you at all. In the Great Hall itself, the sharing arrangements were more fluid and more pragmatic. The benches along the walls might accommodate two people lying head to foot, maximizing use of the available length. Pallets on the floor were shared between people of similar rank or similar function. Two grooms, two kitchen servants, two lower household staff, without any social ceremony marking the arrangement. Children within the household, the pages and the various young servants who were at the bottom of every hierarchy, slept in groups that reflected their status, close together, on the least desirable sleeping surfaces, in the coldest parts of the hall, and often in arrangements that were determined by whoever was responsible for them that evening rather than by any consistent or considered policy. The pages deserve a particular moment of attention here, because their sleeping arrangements encapsulate something important about the medieval understanding of childhood and training that is different enough from modern assumptions to be worth examining. The boys who served as pages in noble households, typically between 7 and 14 years of age, from families of good standing, sent to learn the practical and social arts of their class in someone else's household, slept in groups under supervision, and the supervision was taken seriously not primarily for the boys' comfort but for their formation. The medieval understanding of character development held that the habits of sleep and waking were part of what shaped a person, and that learning to sleep in orderly, disciplined arrangements with appropriate timing and appropriate behavior was part of the training that turned a boy into a gentleman. The page who slept late, who was disorderly in his sleeping arrangements, who disturbed others or failed to rise promptly when called, was failing in his formation as surely as the page who was clumsy with a sword or rude at table. There is something genuinely touching about this, if you let yourself feel it. The small boys of medieval noble households, far from their own families, sleeping in groups in strange castles, learning through the very act of going to sleep the elaborate social choreography that their world required of them. Some of them were homesick, certainly. The medieval literature on childhood separation is not abundant, but what exists suggests that the experience of being sent away from home at 7 or 8 was not emotionally uncomplicated. Others adapted quickly and found in the communal sleeping arrangement of the hall a form of companionship that was not so different from what they had left behind. The travelers and guests who slept in the hall occupied a particularly interesting position in the bed-sharing culture of the castle. The obligation of hospitality in the medieval world was not merely social but moral and religious. The guest was to be welcomed, fed, and sheltered, and turning away a traveler who needed shelter was understood as a genuine moral failure. The practical consequence of this obligation in a busy castle was that the hall frequently contained people who were strangers to each other, placed in the physical proximity of shared sleeping space by the logic of hospitality rather than by any existing relationship. The customs that governed how strangers navigated shared sleeping arrangements were not formally codified in the way that other medieval social protocols were, but they were real and consistent enough to be inferred from the available evidence. You did not take more space than your rank warranted. You did not disturb your neighbors unnecessarily. You did not rifle through the belongings of someone sleeping near you, though the evidence suggests this rule was honored more in theory than in practice, since accounts of theft in castle halls are a consistent presence in medieval court records. You acknowledged, through your behavior, the implicit social contract of the shared sleeping space. I am here because we are all here. I have accepted the conditions of this hospitality, and I will conduct myself accordingly. The one category of traveler for whom the hall-sharing arrangements were most complicated was the woman traveling without the protection of a noble household or a religious community. Female travelers, merchants' wives, pilgrims, women moving between households for various reasons, occupied an awkward position in the castle's sleeping geography, because the hall's communal arrangements offered them neither the privacy of a chamber nor the clear social protection of a recognized household. The solutions that practical castle management developed for this problem varied. A corner screened off with a curtain, a space near the women of the household who could provide implicit social cover, sometimes a room of their own if the castle's layout and the lord's generosity permitted. The vulnerability of women traveling alone at night is a consistent theme in medieval literature and legal records, and the physical arrangements of castle sleeping space were one of the front lines where that vulnerability was either protected against or exploited, depending on the specific household and its specific lord. The children of the castle, not the pages in training, but the actual children of the lord and lady, the heirs and younger children of the family, had their own sleeping arrangements that reflected their position at the intersection of the family's personal life and its public responsibilities. Infants slept with their wet nurses, the women employed specifically to feed and care for them in those earliest months, and the wet nurses' sleeping arrangements were organized entirely around the infant's needs, which is to say they were organized around being woken regularly throughout the night in a pattern that parents of young children will find achingly familiar across the 8 centuries of distance. Older children might share a chamber with servants or nurses whose job was their care and supervision, graduating to more independent arrangements as they aged into the household's training structure. The great bed in the solar, which we established at the beginning of this night as the pinnacle of the sleeping hierarchy, was itself a shared space in one final sense that pulls the whole picture together. It was, in the households where it existed, a social institution as much as a piece of furniture. The custom of the morning levee, the ceremonial getting up of a great lord or lady, conducted in the bedroom with attendants present, made the bedroom a semi-public space even at its most intimate daily moment. The evening coucher, the ceremonial going to bed, mirrored it. The bed stood at the center of a social performance that was about power and status as much as rest, and the people who shared or attended that bed were participants in that performance whether they thought of themselves that way or not. All of this sharing, all of this proximity, all of this negotiated physical closeness across the full spectrum of the castle's population creates a picture of medieval sleeping life that is fundamentally different from the modern Western ideal of the private bedroom as a sanctuary of individual rest. The medieval sleeper was never, or almost never, truly alone. They slept within a social web that was expressed physically in the arrangement of bodies in space, and that web did not pause for the night. It continued, in the warmth of shared blankets and the sound of shared breathing and the particular trust that comes from being unconscious near other people, through every hour of the darkness. You are part of that web right now. The person breathing steadily 2 feet to your left, the dog against your legs, the murmuring presence of the entire hall around you. You are held in all of it, woven into the social fabric of this place, even in your sleep, even as a stranger, even on a floor that you will be very glad to get up from in a few hours. The darkness is at its deepest now. The coals in the hearth have gone from orange to red to the faintest possible glow, barely visible, more felt as warmth than seen as light. The hall is almost entirely dark, almost entirely quiet, and the breathing of the people around you has taken on a synchrony that is not quite perfect but is close enough to feel like music. A slow, deep, collective rhythm that the stone walls hold and amplify into something that is, in its own strange way, beautiful. You are one breath in that rhythm. The morning is coming. You cannot feel it yet, but it is coming, building itself somewhere beyond the castle walls with the patient inevitability of every morning that has ever followed every night. For now, though, there is still this, the shared dark, the warm press of proximity, the ancient, ordinary miracle of many people surviving the night together. Sleep while it lasts. The morning does not arrive gently. You should know this about the medieval castle before it happens to you, which it is about to, because the transition from night to day in this environment is not the soft, graduated awakening that modern life has trained you to expect, the alarm that eases up from silence to sound, the light that filters through curtains at whatever angle you have arranged them, the slow personal negotiation with consciousness that a quiet bedroom allows. The medieval morning is an event. It is collective, it is loud, and it begins before you are ready for it with the absolute indifference to individual preference that characterizes everything about communal life in a place like this. The first sound is the bells. Not the gentle single toll of a small chapel bell, but the full, insistent voice of whatever bell the castle has available, rung with the specific urgency of someone whose job it is to ensure that everyone within earshot understands that the night is over and the day's work is beginning right now. Not in a few minutes, not when you feel ready, but now. The canonical hour of prime, the first hour, the hour of sunrise, was the signal for the castle's population to begin its transition back to the organized, hierarchical, purposeful activity of the day, and the bell that announced it was not making a suggestion. Medieval bells were instruments of social control as much as timekeeping, and the bell of prime had an authority behind it that was simultaneously ecclesiastical, military, and domestic. The church said rise. The Lord said rise. The day said rise. The bell was all three of them speaking at once. Before the prime bell, though, something else has already happened, something that has been happening for the last hour while you were in the deepest part of your second sleep and entirely unaware of it. The castle has been waking in layers, from the bottom up in terms of social hierarchy and from the outside in terms of physical space, and by the time the bell rings for prime, the lowest servants have already been at work for an hour or more. Because the work of preparing the castle for the day begins before the day officially starts, and someone has to do that work, and that someone is never the person sleeping in the feather bed upstairs. The kitchen fire is the first thing. In a large, active castle kitchen, the fire never truly went out, It was banked and managed through the night rather than extinguished. But the transition from the banked night fire to the full working fire of the morning kitchen required specific attention and specific effort. The kitchen servants who drew this task were among the first people up in the entire castle, moving through the cold dark of the pre-dawn kitchen with the focused practicality of people who have done this so many times that they could do it half asleep, which they more or less are. The fire needed to be built up. The water for the morning's cooking needed to be drawn and set to heat. The bread that had been proving through the night needed to be assessed and, if ready, loaded into the ovens. All of this happened in the cold and the dark before the bell rang, and by the time the rest of the castle began to stir, the kitchen was already warm and purposeful and smelling of things that made the transition from sleep to wakefulness considerably more appealing. The stable hands were up before prime as well, because horses require feeding at consistent intervals regardless of what the humans around them would prefer. And the morning feeding and watering of the castle's horses was a non-negotiable start to the day that the animals themselves enforced with their own version of an alarm, the restless shifting, the occasional whinny, the specific sounds of large animals who know that feeding time has arrived and are prepared to make their position on the matter known. The groom who slept in the stable, remember, had no insulation from these communications, and his morning began when the horses decided it did, which was early. The night watch, coming off their final circuit of the battlements, had their own particular relationship with the morning. They had been awake all night, or had at least been required to perform wakefulness all night, and the end of their watch brought a relief that was physical as much as psychological. The relief of being able to stop moving, stop watching, stop performing alertness, and finally lie down in whatever sleeping space awaited them. The night watch slept during the day, or part of it, which placed them permanently slightly out of phase with the rest of the castle's rhythms. Always slightly more tired than everyone else, always slightly more aware of the value of sleep, always slightly contemptuous of people who complained about being woken at prime. Now the bell has rung and the hall is beginning its morning transformation, and this is where you re-enter full consciousness whether you intended to or not. The sound of the bell reaches into the second sleep and extracts you from it with an efficiency that is impressive given how deep in it you were, and for a moment, the moment of orientation that everyone experiences upon waking in an unfamiliar place. You genuinely do not know where you are. The ceiling above you is stone. The light is gray and thin and coming from the high windows at an angle that suggests very early morning. The smell is the smell of the hall, which you have been absorbing all night and which has not improved with familiarity. And around you, the hall is erupting into life. People sit up. People stand. People stretch with the particular sounds of bodies that have been on stone floors all night and are expressing their opinion of this experience through every available joint and muscle. The communal sleeping space reverses its transformation, from dormitory back to hall, with a speed that suggests long practice. Pallets are rolled and moved. Blankets are folded. The dogs, who have been stirring for the last 20 minutes in anticipation of morning activity, are now entirely awake and optimistic, moving through the hall with the bright energy of creatures who have no ambivalence about mornings whatsoever and cannot understand why everyone else is so slow about it. The cold is the first physical fact of the morning. During the night, the fire's residual heat and the collective warmth of the hall's sleeping population maintained a temperature that was livable if not comfortable. Now, as bodies move away from their sleeping spots and the warmth that was pooled in the blankets and the straw dissipates into the larger cold of the hall, the temperature drops noticeably. The cold stone floor, which your body heat had been very slowly warming through your bedding all night, reasserts its fundamental nature the moment you stand on it, and the shock of cold through whatever is on your feet, or through your bare soles if you slept without shoes, which some people did and are now regretting, is one of the most vivid sensory experiences of the morning. You stand up. Your back has opinions. Your hips have opinions. The part of you that spent the night in contact with the floor has a comprehensive and detailed opinion about the entire experience, and it is delivering this opinion now in the language of aches and stiffness that will take the better part of the morning's movement to work through. This is not weakness or poor health on your part. This is simply what a night on a medieval floor does to a human body. And the fact that the people around you are moving with a practiced ease that suggests they experience this every morning and have simply integrated it into their understanding of what mornings feel like is either inspiring or deeply concerning, depending on your perspective. The morning routines of the castle's population are as hierarchically organized as everything else here, and they begin with the most basic physical necessities in ways that remind you that the castle, for all its grandeur, is a place where a large number of people live in close proximity and all of them have the same fundamental morning requirements. The garderobes, the privies built into the thickness of the castle walls, their shafts dropping to the moat or a cesspit below, are the morning's most urgently sought destination for a significant portion of the hall's population, and the brief social negotiation of access to limited facilities first thing in the morning is a universal human experience that transcends every historical boundary with perfect fidelity. The water for washing, and people did wash their faces and hands in the morning. This was a consistent practice across all social levels, a minimum of basic morning hygiene that the medieval world maintained even when full bathing was infrequent, came from the castle's well or cistern, carried in buckets or pitchers to various parts of the building by servants whose morning task this was. The water was cold. It was always cold. There was no hot water available for morning washing except in the kitchen, where the fire was already built up and where the demands of food preparation meant that water for personal washing was at best a secondary priority. Cold water on the face, in a cold room, after a night on a cold floor, is an experience that is genuinely effective at completing the transition from sleep to wakefulness, even if it is not what anyone would choose. Upstairs in the solar, the Lord's morning is being managed with considerably more ceremony than your own. The body servant who slept in or near the chamber was already awake before the bell. The Lord's morning was not supposed to begin with a bell. It was supposed to begin with the quiet, prepared attentiveness of someone who had everything ready before the waking moment arrived. The morning coucher in reverse, the curtains of the great bed drawn back, light admitted, garments laid out, water brought for washing, prayers offered at the prie-dieu before anything else happened. The Lord's morning prayers were as important as his evening ones. The committing of the coming day to God's governance was the liturgical mirror of the committing of the night to God's protection, and the private morning prayers in the solar preceded any public activity, including the formal morning prayers in the chapel that followed. The ladies' morning paralleled the Lord's with its own ceremonial structure, managed by her ladies-in-waiting with the same practiced efficiency. Her hair, braided or covered through the night, was dressed for the day, an operation that, for noble women wearing elaborate styles, required time and skill and the specific attention of someone who knew what they were doing. Her outer garments were brought and assisted onto her body in the reverse of the previous evening's undressing. The whole process of becoming the public person again, the socially legible person whose clothing and hairstyle and bearing announced her rank and her role, took time and attention and the labor of other people, and it happened every morning without exception. The children of the castle had their own morning experience that was shaped by whoever was responsible for them. The pages were woken early, earlier than they would have preferred, certainly, and the speed and orderliness with which they rose was itself an assessed performance, part of the continuous evaluation of their formation that the household conducted. A page who rose promptly, dressed quickly, presented himself in good order, and appeared at morning prayers on time was demonstrating the qualities his training was meant to develop. A page who had to be extracted from his pallet by force, who arrived at prayers disheveled and half asleep, was demonstrating something else, and the demonstration was noted. Morning prayers in the chapel were the formal beginning of the castle's public day, and for the household members who attended them, which in a well-run household meant most of the senior staff and all of the family, they represented the transition from the private, physical world of the night into the social and spiritual world of the day. The chapel at morning prayers was a different space from the chapel at other hours. The light coming in through whatever windows it had was the specific thin light of early morning, the candles on the altar competing with the growing daylight, and the prayers of lauds, the morning office, specifically designed to greet the returning day, had a quality of genuine thanksgiving that was not merely liturgical formula. You had survived the night. The castle had survived the night. The fires had not gotten loose. The walls had not been breached. The demons had been kept at bay. And here you all were, in the cold light of morning, together. Historians still argue whether the medieval experience of morning Thanksgiving, this consistent cross-cultural sense of gratitude for surviving the night that appears in prayers, in literature, in the design of the liturgical hours, reflects a genuinely higher ambient level of nighttime danger than modern people experience, or whether it is a cultural and religious convention that was maintained even as the actual danger decreased. The honest answer is probably both, in varying proportions at different times and places, but the emotional reality behind the convention, the sense that morning was not guaranteed, that waking was a gift rather than a default, is one of the most humanly resonant aspects of medieval daily life. The Great Hall, by the time morning prayers were concluded, was already being set up for the day. The trestle tables that had been cleared and stacked the night before were being reassembled for the morning meal. Fresh rushes, where they were available, were being laid. The fire was being rebuilt from the coals, and the smell of fresh wood smoke added to the morning's sensory texture. The various members of the household were finding their morning rolls and filling them with the automatic efficiency of people who have done this every day for years. And you are standing in the middle of it, stiff from the floor and cold from the morning and hungry in the sharp, uncomplicated way that a night of real sleep and a morning of cold air and physical activity produces. And you are watching the castle reassemble itself around you from its nighttime dissolution into its daytime form. The Great Hall, which was a dormitory 8 hours ago, is becoming a hall again. The people who were horizontal are vertical. The private has become public. The night is over. You made it. This is not a small thing. The medieval morning, with its prayers of thanksgiving and its collective reassembly of the household, understood something that the modern world has largely forgotten in the warmth of its insulated houses and its reliable utilities and its ambient safety, that surviving the night was an achievement. Not a heroic one, usually, not one that required courage or great effort on most nights, but an achievement nonetheless, a passage through the darkness that was neither guaranteed nor trivial, and that ended each morning in the light with a quality of gratitude that was earned rather than assumed. The fire is going now, building from coals to flame, throwing its uneven warmth across the hall in the familiar way. Someone is carrying bread from the kitchen. Someone else is drawing ale. The morning meal, simpler than the evening supper, practical and functional rather than ceremonial, is assembling itself with the quiet efficiency of a household that knows its routines. You find a place at one of the long tables. The wood is cold under your hands. The bread, when it arrives, is dense and dark and real, and the ale is thin and slightly sour and the best thing you have tasted since yesterday. Around you, the household is eating and talking in the subdued, practical way of people who have woken up and have things to do, and the conversation is about the day ahead, the work, the travel, the obligations and appointments and tasks that fill the hours between this morning and the next night. The stone walls around you hold the warmth of the fire and the cold of their own deep mass simultaneously, as they have always done, as they will continue to do long after everyone in this hall today is gone. The castle endures. The nights accumulate inside it, one after another, each one full of sleeping bodies and burning fires and prayers against the dark, each one ending in a morning just like this one. You survived yours. And now, as the morning light grows in the hall around you and the fire builds and the bread passes from hand to hand along the table, let the sounds begin to soften. Let the voices around you fade gradually into something more like murmur than speech, and let the murmur fade further still into the deep, steady sound of the fire alone, breathing in the old stone room. The castle is here. The walls are solid. The morning has come exactly as it always does, dependable and unhurried, and whatever the night held. The sounds, the cold, the strangeness, the ancient fears. It is behind you now, tucked away into the darkness where it belongs. You can let your shoulders drop. You can let your hands rest open on the table, or wherever your hands are right now, in whatever comfortable place they have found. The medieval morning asks nothing more of you tonight. The pages have gone to their lessons. The Lord has gone to his hall. The horses are fed and the bread is baked and the watch has finally, gratefully, gone to their beds. The fire breathes. The stone holds the warmth. Outside, somewhere beyond the walls, the world is going about its ancient business. The birds and the wind and the slow turning of the season, and none of it requires anything from you right now. You have been to a place that is 800 years away and you have slept there, imperfectly and communally and in the cold, and you have woken in the same gray morning light that everyone who ever spent a night in those old stone walls woke in, and you have eaten the bread and drunk the ale and felt the fire on your face. That is enough. That is, in the medieval understanding of things, more than enough. Let the hall grow quiet now. Let the fire drop back to its low, steady glow. Let the sounds of the castle, the bells, the footsteps, the breathing of the many, soften into a rhythm that is less sound than sensation, a vibration in the stone that you can feel without hearing, deep and slow and very, very old. You are warm. You are safe. The night is over, and the next one is a long way off. Close your eyes. The castle keeps the watch. Sleep well,